Good evening for all our guests in Israel, in Europe, in Australia, and good afternoon to our guests in the United States. I'm happy to see you all and to start off the fourth season of our series of lectures, Winnicottian Ideas in the Contemporary Clinic, edited by David Ketron and myself as part of the scientific activity of the Israel Winnicott Center. The lectures are given by senior psychoanalysts from the center's teaching staff and distinguished guests from abroad. Our aim is to put into focus and explore selected ideas from Winnicott's vast work, theoretical and clinical, as they are rethought and revived in contemporary clinical practice, inspired by his legacy. These are not normal days here and everywhere. The horrific events of the October 7 massacre and its aftermath, which has brought so much pain and loss for people in our region, are still our present. The trauma is ongoing and is affecting us all. The present refuses to make its natural transformation into a past. Still, while experiencing grief, fear, and worry, we wish to adhere to life. We must search inside our souls, as well as reach out to our cultural resources and to our valuable friendships all over the world, in order to create a new ground on which resilience and hope can grow. As therapists, we are requested to do it in each and every session. We witness, we participate, we cry. Winnicott gave us a deep understanding of trauma, but also of the love of life. Today, I'm honored and happy to host a distinguished psychoanalyst and a good friend, Angela Joyce. Angela Joyce is fellow and training and supervising psychoanalyst and child psychoanalyst with the British Psychoanalytical Society. She trained as a child analyst at the Anna Freud Center, was a founding member of the pioneering parent-infant project there, applying psychoanalysis to working with babies and their families, and jointly led the child psychotherapy service. She has recently retired from full-time private practice in London. She is a past chair of the curriculum committee at the BPAS and a member of its education committee. Recent past chair of the Winnicott Trust, a trustee of the Squiggle Foundation, and has been an honorary senior lecturer at University College London. She teaches widely and particularly in Winnicottian studies, child analysis, and psychotherapy, and she has published in these areas over a number of years. Among other publications, she has edited together with Leslie Caldwell, Reading Winnicott for the New Library of Psychoanalysis Teaching Series. She wrote the introduction to Volume 6 of the collected works of Donald Winnicott and edited the papers from 215 conference, Donald Winnicott and the History of the Present. Together with the Parent-Infant Project team at the Anna Freud Center, she contributed to their books, Claiming the Baby, Early Relational Trauma, and Working with Fathers in Psychoanalytic Parent-Infant Psychotherapy. Angela was a key speaker in the Israel Winnicott Center Decade Conference, and actually she's accompanying our center for many years since its foundation as a member of its International Advisory Board. Angela will speak now about object constancy and absence in Winnicott, through the lens of the Piggle. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Smeda, and indeed a very heartfelt thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. It was supposed to be done, wasn't it, in the autumn, and because of what you've spoken of, the terrible tragedies of October and subsequently, it was postponed until now. The Piggle is a unique example of Winnicott's actual clinical work, written as he was treating this young child and annotated later. Although his writings are peppered with clinical vignettes and references, and there is the full volume of therapeutic consultations in child psychiatry, nevertheless, there is only one other extended account of his psychoanalytic clinic holding an interpretation. That piece is his description of work done originally with an adolescent, but who, as written in that volume, had returned following a psychotic breakdown in his late 20s. Winnicott's treatment of the Piggle took place in the mid-60s, in the last decade of his life, when he was quite a frail man, suffering from the chronic heart disease that would eventually kill him in 1971. In this presentation, I want to revisit his work with special reference to the Piggle, now 60 years later, and to think about it now through the lens of a concern within contemporary psychoanalysis, the presence of absence in our psychic functioning and its provenance. I also want to pay tribute to and use a quite recent publication, a book called Finding the Piggle, edited by the American analyst Corinne Mazur, full of incredibly rich papers from a variety of perspectives, reconsidering the Piggle in the light of the decades of clinical development since the original work was done. This book prompted my own revisiting and has stimulated many lines of thought and association. Also, in many places across the world, in Europe, and perhaps most tragically at this moment here in Israel-Palestine, there are situations of ongoing societal trauma where wars are raging and children are exposed to the most terrible violence and loss. We know now so much better their consequences for children, not only directly, but the dark shadow of these experiences later on in their own lives, and then in their unconscious communication with their own children and their children's children down the generations. I will explore the relevance of these phenomena in the light of the recent scholarship that has emerged in relation to the Piggle and her family history, and speculate about the intrusion into the mother's mind of the ghosts, phantoms of her and her family's past, possibly leading to her psychic absence in Piggle's early life. Absence and its significance has been at the heart of psychoanalytic understanding of development and mental life since Freud. In a footnote to Two Principles of Mental Functioning, he observed that provided one includes with it the care it receives from its mother, the baby could experience the pleasure principle as a reality. In the absence of the feeding breast, he said, it probably hallucinates the fulfillment of its internal needs. Indeed, this is the way station, not only to the establishment of the reality principle, but the creation of mental representations, dependent as they are upon the oscillation in experience of the presence and absence of the caregiving other. Later in Inhibition, Symptoms and Anxiety, exploring the distinction between pain, mourning and anxiety, Freud wrote, referring to the young infant, as soon as it loses sight of its mother, it behaves as if it were never going to see her again, and repeated consoling experiences to the contrary are necessary before it learns that her disappearance is usually followed by her reappearance. In these circumstances, it can, as it were, feel longing unaccompanied by despair. This condenses a complexity of processes and experiences. It is the theoretical basis within psychoanalysis of Winnicott's Good Enough Mother, and he references that footnote in the theory of the parent-infant relationship. Indeed, the conditions from which object constancy is established and the grounds upon which we can then think about absence as being a necessary and productive part of the infant's everyday experience. Repeatedly emphasized as the necessary precondition for healthy, good enough development is that repetition of consoling experiences, together with the absence of overwhelming anxiety or despair. In different ways and with different emphases, the context of care that the infant receives in this oscillation has been fundamental to understanding both the nature of maternal absence and its impact. Winnicott, Bion, Green, and myriad others have considered the fundamental importance of absence for the development of mind as an entity which has its own dimensions and separateness. The concept of object constancy was developed by Heinz Hartmann to denote a stage when the growing child's tie to its love object became stable and enduring in a relation, independent of need satisfaction and the impact of powerful affects in the face of the actual absence of the maternal figure. Anna Freud included the concept of her developmental line from dependency to self-reliance, and Margaret Mahler placed it at the center of her separation-individuation developmental trajectory. Indeed, in the phenomena explored by John Bowlby and his colleagues, and I'm particularly referring to Joyce and James Robertson, the consequences for the child of separation from the mother and the care received in her absence was of central concern. Perhaps it was Andre Green, heavily dependent upon Winnicott, who looked most closely at a particular aspect of the mother's mind to explore not just the physical absence of the mother, but as powerful her psychical absence in situations of her being overwhelmed by trauma, the dead mother complex. So from this perspective, the young infant's experience of absence in the to and fro of ordinary caregiving is fundamental to establishing a sense of continuity and reality, but only so far as the repeated consoling experiences are reliably available, together with the absence of overwhelming anxiety or despair. The mother's mind is not clouded or deadened by traumatic intrusions, and the separations are not for not too long. If these seminal conditions of absence do not prevail, then far from being a necessary ingredient of experience for development, continuity of being is at risk of rupture and the sense of reality distorted. At the beginning of postnatal life, representations are created and kept alive by the repeated moment-by-moment experiences of life with the person caring for the child, and the inner imago reinforced by, to quote Winnicott, the availability of the external, separated off and actual mother, along with her technique of childcare. The movement from the infant's initial illusory creation of what is there to be found requires the mother's adaptation to a new state in the infant, such that disillusion facilitates the emergence of transitionality and the intermediate area of experience. In Winnicott's account, this is on the way to object usage, but remains the source of creative meaning in the person's life. Disillusion is another form of presence but absence, this time necessary and rooted in the already experienced, fully adaptive presence of the mother. In Location of Cultural Experience, Winnicott explores the time factor and proposes for the baby a formula of X plus Y plus Z, where in X amount of time of separation, the baby becomes distressed, but is mended because of the mother's return at Y. In X plus Y amount of time, the baby is not altered, but in X plus Y plus Z time, the baby is traumatized. The mother's return does not mend the baby's trauma, and primitive defenses are employed to deal with the unthinkable anxiety. The baby's continuity of being has been disrupted, and, Winnicott avers, the baby is permanently deprived of the root which could provide continuity with personal beginning. In contrast to what he assumes is the experience of most very young children, those who've had X plus Y plus Z time of separation, psychical as well as physical, I question, we have to carry with them the experience of having been mad, meaning simply a breakup of whatever may exist at the time of a personal continuity of existence. In this account, the X plus Y plus Z baby is in a state of unthinkable anxiety, longing accompanied by despair. For Winnicott, this early experience of too much absence is not one of frustration for the baby, but of exposure to the most extreme anxiety, annihilation, resulting from the failure of the facilitating environment. I don't want to presume, however, that the physical presence of the mother of maternal object is the only or even the sufficient factor to be considered. The mother's mental state is critical, and Winnicott was writing about this from the early 1940s. His 1948 paper, Reparation in Respect of Mothers' Organized Defenses Against Depression, attests to the impact of the maternal mind on the minutiae of the young child's development. And there's now a huge literature on this phenomenon. It raises for our consideration and speculation what we might discern from this case report about Piggle's early experience of maternal parental care that might have contributed to the extremity of her response to the birth of her sister. To turn now to the Piggle, and for those of you not so familiar with Winnicott's report, I will briefly summarize the referral and the work. It was not a case which he saw in his NHS National Health Service clinic. It was a private referral from parents who were informed and sensitive to the predicament of their elder daughter, Gabrielle, who was known by her nickname Piggle. From their point of view, she had suffered greatly following the arrival of her sister, who had come too early for her. Piggle was 21 months old when her sister was born. Winnicott comments in a footnote that it was only much later that he learned that the mother herself had experienced the birth of a sibling at this age. As I will consider in a few moments, this reference to the parental history does not form a significant part of his understanding of Piggle, and so it is of note that here he does point to it, and perhaps by implication and extension to some of the mother's experience of her daughter's difficulties, and then the impact of that on Gabrielle. Piggle's acute jealousy apparently abated quite quickly after the birth of Susan, the shush baby, her sister, but symptoms developed. And here is an extract from the letter the parents sent to Winnicott asking for his help. She, Piggle, has a black mummy and daddy. The black mummy comes in after her at night and says, "Where are my yams?" And they explain the yam means to yam, to eat. She pointed out her breasts, calling them yams, and pulling them to make them longer. Sometimes she is put into the toilet by the black mummy. The black mummy who lives in her tummy and who can be talked to there on the telephone is often ill and difficult to make better. The second strand of fantasy, which started earlier, is about the Babacar. Every night she calls again and again, "Tell me about the Babacar, all about the Babacar." The black mummy and daddy are often in the Babacar together, or some man alone. There is very occasionally a black Piggle in evidence. We call Gabrielle the Piggle, she explains. There was a time only just past when she badly scratched her face every night. Often she seems vivid and spontaneous and fully alive, but we thought we would ask for your help at this time, lest she should settle down and harden herself against her distress as the only way of coping with it. Piggle's symptoms were acute, but probably would not be recognised and regarded as reaching threshold today, or perhaps then, for a public service to respond. In fact, still too many very young children are not regarded as meriting a response from mental health services. They're too young, is the idea. The idea that a young child establishing a pathological defences, or indeed in their fantasy life, suggesting severe psychological distress, which would later contribute to further mental disturbance, was already of interest to Winnicott. He had written about providing interventions that, I quote, "a trained psychoanalyst can do, which is something other than analysis, and do it usefully." And I think this reflects Winnicott's profound identity as a psychoanalyst and his commitment to disseminating and using its understandings wherever he could. All his clinical encounters and extraclinical writings are saturated with his psychoanalytic sensibility. He seemingly was determined that Piggle should receive this treatment if she needed it. The family lived at a distance, making it not possible for Piggle to be seen on a regular basis in London. Apparently, referral to Donald Meltzer was mooted. He was later to move to Oxford and certainly treated children, but at that time seemingly was still located in London. In fact, Piggle's mother had a professional link with him, so perhaps it would not have been a welcome suggestion. In an unpublished letter, Piggle's mother writes to Claire Winnicott 10 years after the end of the treatment and 5 years after Winnicott's death. She said, he, Winnicott, told us that if we wanted analysis, that's her emphasis, we should go to Dr. Meltzer, which we mercifully did not do. I would much rather people were told that their analytical knowledge, experience, insight, etc. can be used on a much wider canvas than they may hitherto have imagined, so that they are expanded, but yet not feel unhorsed, shown up as doing unnecessary and futile things themselves when they do full analysis, when they see cases regularly and conscientiously. So she was in support of what came to be called analysis on demand. Distance certainly is cited as a reason for Winnicott's decision to offer Piggle so-called analysis on demand, occasional sessions that were intended to be responsive to Piggle's expressed requests. We might say this would be quite an ask for a young child of 2.5 to articulate such need or desire, though it did prove to be possible for her to tell her parents that she wanted to see Dr. Winnicott again many times over the ensuing years. Putting the child in charge, so to speak, of her treatment in this way would be considered novel even now. Despite this, it is evident from the text that the gaps between consultations were often too long, as it is perhaps inevitable that the demands of the toddler would have to be modified by those of the adult world. The treatment took place over approximately 3 years until she was 5 years and 2 months. She was seen for 16 consultations, they were called, with varying lengths of time between them. The shortest time between consultations is between the 4th and the 5th, just 2 weeks. But the gap between many was much longer, often into several months, and clearly from the letters written by the parents, not on demand. That is from Piggle's point of view. Piggle is reported many times asking to see Dr. Winnicott and having to wait. Her parents describe acute distress if she was not seen in a timely fashion. In a letter from Claire Winnicott to the mother, she comments, I always felt sorry that you mentioned the time when Donald couldn't see Gabrielle because I'm sure he knew where he was with her well enough to know that disaster would be evaded. That was her spelling mistake, evaded, even though there was a risk involved. I think that it is as well to say that, because people might not realize, as he certainly did, how vitally important it is in this method to meet, emphasis, to meet the demand. I think he was ill at that time, wasn't he? I know that he had begun to realize painfully that analysts who are not really in good health ought not to be doing this kind of work of this kind. In his assessment of Piggle's need for treatment, Winnicott comments how the child's illness dominates the scene and how, after the first couple of sessions with him, a clearly organized illness pattern was apparent. Gradually, over time, he says, the illness pattern dissolved to some extent, giving way to a series of maturational stages that had to be worked over again, although they had clearly been experienced satisfactorily in Gabrielle's infancy, that is, before her mother's pregnancy. Here he is describing how, in his view, the analysis on demand setting for this patient allowed the regression that was inherent in the illness pattern to recover and for the pattern of normal development to be restored. A major element in Winnicott's decision that analysis on demand was a suitable intervention for Gabrielle was that, alongside his recognition of the dominance of the illness pattern, he also saw what he believed to be the essential health in this young patient, and I quote again, a quality that was always evident to the analyst, even when clinically and at home the child was really ill. Their mutual engagement was apparent, again quoting, as the treatment had a momentum of its own that was evident from its inception. Gabrielle came to do work, and each time she came for treatment, she brought a problem she was able to display. End of quote. I'm not so convinced in the apparent health of this little girl. And I wonder if Winnicott really underestimated the illness pattern that he also recognised. Did Piggle's apparently healthy development also have elements of precocity and a defensive carapace that broke down under the stresses of her repeated losses of her mother? Many readers comment on her qualities as an articulate, bright little girl, which undoubtedly she was, but I wonder. Psychoanalysis partage. Winnicott says in his introduction to the Piggle that it was part written by the parents, and this reflects that the work was partage, shared with the parents. Included in the text are letters and descriptions of phone calls with the parents, indicating that indeed Winnicott saw them as co-workers with him in attending to and analysing their daughter's difficulties. And in their afterword to the published piece, they are appreciative of having been included in that way. But perhaps the way Winnicott included Piggle's parents also had a less than helpful side. There's a collegial sense in the way he describes their joint work, and cooperation between clinician and parents, I would agree, is enormously important in terms of their significance, the parents' significance in the life of the child. The therapeutic alliance, which with child work extends to the parents and maybe even other family members. And for also the clinician to be aware of the inevitable loyalty conflict a child patient will feel in relation to the clinician and parents. Perhaps for Winnicott, it made it rather difficult to have sufficient distance or objectivity from the parents to think much beyond their framing of Piggle's problem, despite his recognition that she was quite an ill child. We, of course, don't know what else passed between the analyst and parents, but for instance, there is no account given of Winnicott taking a family history, or indeed in individual histories of mother and father, which many child analysts would see as essential in arriving at a sense of what was going on for a child. Their absence from this text may have been for reasons of confidentiality. We just don't know. But the parents presented the problem as one of adaptation to the arrival of the new baby. And this is an essential part of Winnicott's own understanding of Piggle's distress. Juliet Mitchell has done much to re-alert the psychoanalytic world to the significance of siblings in our inner lives. And it is perhaps in work with young children where that significance is most apparent. In Mitchell's view, the very possibility of a sibling who has equal rights to their position on mother's lap is a major trauma for a child. So perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised that Piggle's reaction is so strong. But I would contend that the persistence and strength of her symptoms invite further inquiry beyond that paradigm. Perhaps some answers might be found in a broader consideration of the context of Piggle's family. In the book I mentioned earlier, Finding the Piggle, and an earlier publication in the International Journal, through extensive research and connection with the grown-up Gabrielle by Deborah Leibniz, some of that family history is now available. If Winnicott had inquired of the family history, not even over the earlier generations, but just the more recent times, he would have learned about the Holocaust history of the mother's family and the father's history of loss and migration. Perhaps his understanding of Gabrielle's loss of the exclusive place in her mother's mind might have been extended such that he might not have used the paradigm of her Oedipal and sibling rivalry as primary for interpretation. In the 1960s, there was not yet a strong movement within psychoanalysis to examine intergenerational history, although Winnicott was himself renowned for his attention to the mental states of parents, mothers, and perhaps less so fathers in their care of their children. It was only much later that clinical phenomena began to be described and theorized, which revealed the impact of unprocessed histories on later generations. This is linked, though not exclusively, to the Holocaust and its echoes down the later years of the 20th century and into the present century. It has more recently become an area of great interest within psychoanalysis, and there is a growing body of literature reflecting this development in the psychoanalytic canon. Deborah Leibniz's work on Piggle's history explores the possible influence these intergenerational factors may have had in this case. She traces aspects suggested but not elaborated in Winnicott's text, which open up possibilities of intergenerational factors that fill out and extend Winnicott's account. One such relates to Piggle's given names, Esther, Gabrielle. In the text, Winnicott does not disguise her given name, Gabrielle, itself remarkable in a clinical report for publication, though this was discussed when publication was being planned, and the family, including Gabrielle herself, agreed to the use of her given name. Winnicott also refers to her as Gabrielle, Esther not used by the child or her family at that point. In another letter from mother to Claire Winnicott, she remarks that she, Esther Gabrielle, her legal name, she is called Esther, her second name, although her legal name is Esther Gabrielle. Esther is her first name, but she says in this letter that she is called Esther, her second name at school, because when she first started, she would not commit her most private name to so doubtful a setting as school. This is very interesting and opaque, I think. Which is most private, Gabrielle or Esther? Leibniz interrogates the significance of the names given to Piggle, and what emerges is that Esther was the name of Piggle's great-aunt who died in Auschwitz. Gabrielle was not disguised, but Esther was. That is not referenced at all in the Piggle text. Indeed, as Leibniz points out, in Consultation 10, Piggle bursts out that her name is Deborah Gabrielle. And that's an amazing coincidence. Deborah Gabrielle. Esther has truly been Scotomized, absent but present. I don't think it's wild of me to wonder if this absent but present indication of the Holocaust in the mother's history probably had some bearing on mother's states of mind as she cared for her first infant, Esther Gabrielle Piggle, at the very least unconsciously. In addition to Winnicott's work and that of Green and others, attachment literature helps us think about parental preoccupied states of mind and their impact on the young infant. Later on, I will consider aspects of the text that might help us link these phenomena together. If we take the evident and acute feelings aroused by the arrival of Shush Baby, new baby Susan, whose name was disguised when Piggle was less than 2 years old, there is another aspect which Winnicott does not refer to, and that is the practice in the 1960s and for quite a long time afterwards in the UK of women giving birth remaining in hospital for 10 days or more, so-called lying in. We're not told of the arrangements for Piggle's care or any consideration that the fact of this separation might be regarded as an etiological factor in Piggle's breakdown. Corinne Mazur discussed this in her own chapter in the book she edited, Finding the Piggle. That he knew about this issue is evident in Winnicott's review of some of the films made by Joyce and James Robertson, who were close collaborators with John Bowlby, chronicling the impact of separations on young children in different situations. There he was fully in agreement with the painful truth of their effects, and even went so far as to say, for most of us, it needs no proof. Absence of any reference to this in the story of the Piggle then is notable. This is all the more interesting in that several of the Robertson films are about such children who had to endure both the separation from their mothers and the subsequent arrival of new siblings. Winnicott viewed Bowlby as not taking sufficient cognizance of the inner world and the power of unconscious fantasy in shaping the experience of the external environment. As we will see, Winnicott's attention in this treatment is strongly focused on Piggle's fantasies about the Babacar, the Shush Baby, and Black Mummy and Oedipal desires within the classical theories of psychosexual development. If he had attended to Piggle's probable experience of her mother's absence when Shush Baby was born, and not seemingly only the subsequent disturbance, then the nature of her fantasies, blackness, Babacar, etc., and her acute distress and anxiety, her experience of Winnicott's comings and goings, and especially the gaps between the sessions of this analysis on demand, might have been addressed in different ways in the treatment. I'm curious that Winnicott, so attentive to the impact of the early infancy of mother states of mind, did not apparently consider addressing more pre-Oedipal phenomena in the clinical work reported. How and to what extent might this possible separation when mother was lying in have disrupted not just Piggle's attachment to her maternal object and exacerbated any expected eruption of sibling rivalry, but also the more internal development of her sense of unit status and being a whole person? Following Winnicott, this itself is dependent upon the actual details of the infant's connection to the maternal object, its rhythms of comings and goings. I contend that the extremity of Gabrielle's response to the arrival of her baby sister can be linked to this disruption and perhaps indicated an already pre-existing sensitivity to the mother's absence, psychical more so than physical, itself overdetermined. Indeed, on referral, Piggle's early relationship with her mother is described in rather mixed ways. She was described as having been very much a person, giving one the feeling of great inner resources, breastfed for 9 months, had great poise, hardly ever fell when she learned to walk, and hardly ever cried when she fell. However, she was also somewhat high-handed with her mother and showed very passionate feelings towards her father. Since the birth of the new baby, Piggle's attitude to mother had changed, and I quote from the letter, towards her mother, whose existence she had almost appeared to ignore, my emphasis. Gabrielle shows much more warmth, though sometimes also more resentment. She has become very obviously reserved towards her father. I wonder if this is a clue about something subtly awry early on for mother and daughter, and that this may have been connected with mother's Holocaust history, bringing the trauma of catastrophic loss unconsciously into that first relationship. This hypothesis lies alongside the recognition that in so many ways, Piggle was seen as doing very well before the birth of her sister. Jan Abram traces Winnicott's realization in his pediatric work that many of his young patients suffered from early disillusion, by which he meant that too early in these children's lives, their initial creative encounter with mother, external reality, had been disrupted, compromising the capacity of the subject to have a sense of his or her own realness and being. We can see in Piggle's breakdown that her developing capacity for creative play was one of the early symptoms noticed by her parents, and the subsequent dominance of her delusional persecutory fantasies in what took place. I quote, "The Piggle hardly ever plays with any concentration now. She hardly ever admits to being herself. She is either the baby or more often the mummy," end quote. This, I think, reflects the disintegration of Piggle's self, following on the rupture of her connection with her maternal object, which may have been already somewhat compromised, and the failure of their capacity to maintain that connectedness. From an Anna-Freudian perspective, Piggle would be regarded as not yet having achieved object constancy, that is, able to hold on internally to the imago of the maternal object under the duress of separation, thus making actual separation perilous. Winnicott's theorizing of the developmental trajectory, broadly speaking, is clear. Either the baby emerges into childhood and beyond, living creatively, able to play through that early experience of illusion, or it becomes apparent very early on that the capacity for play and playfulness is likely to be impaired, and with it an inner sense of futility and meaninglessness is present. Of course, capacities can be developed and lost, and perhaps this is the territory we're in. Can we call into question then Winnicott's initial assessment that Piggle is overall developing healthily? Was her self-possession and high-handedness as an infant reflective of some element in that early connection with the maternal object, one that impaired the robust establishment of unit status and wholeness? We cannot know, but I would agree with Leibniz and suggest the long shadow of mother's family, Holocaust history, and its impact. It seems to me that Piggle's breakdown following the arrival of her baby sister can be understood in this way. She was maddened not so much by the baby replacing her in the cot, although that would be a contributing factor, but by the disintegration of her unit self, consequent upon the Z component of her mother's absence. In the referral letter from the parents, mother says she hardly ever admits to be herself, surely an indication of this loss of self through trauma. Nearly 2 years later, after all the work done in the analysis on demand, the representation of that absence starkly re-emerged in the transference to Winnicott, when the absence between sessions was too long. He became black when she went away, an allusion to the meaning of the early symptoms of the black mummy frightening her at night. Interesting also to note that she felt she was the actor in the scene, as is so often the case with young children in their omnipotent egocentricity. It was her leaving that caused the blackness. On her return, she fixed her eyes onto Winnicott and gave him a good look, as he interpreted in the session, in order to see him as white again, to restore what had been utterly changed in the interim. So here is the section from session number 12, for which she had to wait 4 months. So this is from the text. She was playing with some toy animals, and Winnicott's attention was alerted to her referencing black. And she said, Gabrielle said, "Black is nothing. What is it?" Winnicott comments, "I have been very interested in Gabrielle's use of the idea of black, and here was a new version of this theme." And he said, "Is black what you don't see?" She replied, "I can't see you because you're black." He said, "Do you mean that when I'm away, then I'm black and you can't see me? And then you ask to come and see me and you have a good look at me and I'm light or something else that isn't black?" And she said, "When I go away and look at you, you go all black, don't you, Dr. Winnicott?" And he said, "So after a time, you have to see me so as to bring me white again." After a short while, during which she carried on playing, Winnicott continued to her, "If there's a long interval, then you begin to get worries about this black thing, which makes me gone black. And then you don't know what the black thing is." And he comments, "Here I was referring to the black mummy and the black objects of her anxiety states." "Yes," she says, in a fairly convincing way, he says. And he continues, "So when you came, you had a good look at me to bring me white again." "Yes," she said. I've come to feel that this material in session 12 is the heart of the matter. It is the re-emergence in the transference of Piggle's earlier breakdown, consequent upon her experience of her maternal object's psychic absence in her infancy. We might also invoke the ideas from that other paper, Fear of Breakdown, about the breakdown that was not experienced, as there was not yet a self to integrate it. If we do so, then this trauma was not only the absence of mother when away lying in, followed by the experience of losing her then to the new baby, but an earlier one around which a self-possessed, high-handed, false self had been constructed. Piggle's experience of the absence of her mother giving birth to Shush Baby and her preoccupation with the new baby would then have brought the earlier rupture closer to consciousness, and the ongoing analytic process supported that emergence. In the prior 11 sessions on demand, which I will discuss below, constitute the work of the analysis, which comes to fruition in this material in Consultation 12, where we see the representation of the disintegration of Piggle's self and the absence of her maternal object, who is represented as having disappeared into blackness. So how did he get there? And did he realize this was the crux of the work? It's a bit high-handed of me to say this to him. He's not here to defend himself. In the preface to the publication, Claire Winnicott and Ray Shepherd, who edited the text, say of it, "It's a lively account of two people working and playing together with purposeful intensity and enjoyment, reflecting Winnicott's view that enjoyment is paramount for a child playing." He says, "As a matter of principle, the analyst always allows the enjoyment to become established before the content of the play is used for interpretation, end of quote. Claire also notes how, although Donald perceives and accepts the transference, he does much more. He brings it to life by enacting the various roles allotted to him. The dramatization of the child's inner world enables her to experience and play with those fantasies that most disturb her. This occurs in small doses and in a safe setting. The creative tension in the transference is maintained, and the level of anxiety and suspense is kept within the child's capacity so that playing can continue, end of quote. In Winnicott's description of his work with Piggle, he was concerned as ever with the possibility of a sense of aliveness in his patient, which for such a young child would be apparent in whether she manifested a capacity for playing and enjoyment. Right at the very beginning, and in response to her announcement that I am too shy, Winnicott writes, I therefore got the mother in with her and told her not to help at all, and she sat back on the couch with the Piggle beside her. Already I had made friends with the teddy bear who was sitting on the floor by the desk. Now I was in the back part of the room, sitting on the floor, playing with the toys. I said to Piggle, whom I could not actually see, bring Teddy over here, I want to show him the toys. She went immediately and brought the teddy over and helped me to show him the toys. She then started playing with them herself, mostly taking parts of trains out of the muddle. She kept on saying, I've got a, whatever it was. After about 5 minutes, the mother slipped out into the waiting room. So his playfulness constitutes his invitation to her to engage with him, rather than any premature interpretation of her anxiety, and her responsiveness emboldened him to proceed. And not that interpretation is very far away. Very soon he marks the significance of the baby sister. And here's another quote from that first consultation. Then began something which was repeated over and over again. Here's another one, and here's another one. This had to do mostly with trucks and engines, but it did not seem to matter much what it was that she made this comment about. I took this therefore as a communication and said, another baby, the shush baby. This was evidently the correct thing to say because now she started giving me an account of the time the shush baby came as she remembered it. What she said was, I was a baby, I was in a cot, I was asleep, I had the bottle. In that opening session, Winnicott was the analyst who wanted to understand and bring out the latent meaning of his patient's presentation, especially when he intuits it is causing anxiety. In contrast to some of his late writings where he is critical of too much interpretation, here he doesn't hesitate to put into words his understanding of what Piggle might be communicating. Piggle's identification with Shush Baby is noted, but he is more alert to the indications of her anxiety, which follows his bold response to her play, when she tries to put a stick from the toy train through the window, but it gets stuck. Then she gets it in, and Winnicott says to her, something about the man putting something into the woman to make a baby. She quite quickly wants to leave the room and find her mother, to which he acknowledges her fear and asks if she has frightening dreams. She then mentions the Babacar for the first time, which Winnicott takes as a reference to the shush baby. This seems to have enabled her to stay in the room for a little while, but her anxiety is very evident as she tidies up the toys as if getting ready to leave, putting away all the disturbing elements of their playful connection. Winnicott is candid about feeling at a bit of a loss, saying that he is wondering what to do, and then rather clumsily he asks if she's ever angry with her mother, linking up, he says, the idea of a black mummy with her rivalry with her mother because both of them love the same man, daddy. Oedipal level interpretation. Although he says he feels quite safe in saying this, Piggle doesn't seem to be, as she completes her tidying up and says she'd like to fetch mummy and daddy. Seemingly Piggle had given Winnicott short shrift, and later the parents write telling him that Piggle had commented afterwards that Dr. Winnicott doesn't know about Babacar, about the Babacar. My reading of this opening session in my reading, it seems that Winnicott does recognise the degree of disturbance in Piggle. He describes in his summary of the session the elements of madness, Babacar, system re-black, nightmares, and in some ways there are indications of contact between them. Nevertheless, the profundity of her breakdown somehow evades him, and she demonstrates that by tidying up, and her pronouncement that he doesn't know about the Babacar, I think, indicating her madness. He seems to have taken the jealousy identified by the parents as correct assessment of what is the matter, and with such a complex emotion belonging to the world of whole persons, the more primitive anxieties of disintegration are not seemingly really considered. Nevertheless, on the way to its materializing within the structure of analysis on demand, into which is built the powerful presence of absence, Winnicott and Piggle do a huge amount of playful elaboration of her Oedipal fantasies. We might see Winnicott as intent on pursuing his psychoanalytic task of uncovering the unconscious meaning to his patient of her experiences, a whole person full of conflicting unconscious wishes and anxieties rooted in her instinctual life. His Freudian identity is evident in his focus on her psychosexual development, as his interpretations and his contribution to her play in the transitional space of the work attend to her Oedipal longings, as they now have been shaped by the arrival of her little sister. In consultation too, 5 weeks later, he immerses himself in the drama of her playing. For instance, she's playing a game of the toy animals eating. So this is what happens here. Then she started a new and very deliberate chapter in the game. "I'm a baby too," she announced, as she came out headfirst onto the floor between her father's legs. Winnicott says, "I want to be the only baby. I want all the toys." Piggle says, "You've got all the toys." Winnicott says, "But I want to be the only baby. I don't want there to be any more babies." She got on her father's lap again and was born again. Piggle says, "I'm the baby too." Winnicott says, "I want to be the only baby." And in a different voice, he says to her, "Shall I be cross?" Piggle says, "Yes." And Winnicott describes himself, I made a big noise, knocked over the toys, hit my knees and said, "I want to be the only baby." This pleased her very much, although she looked a little frightened and said to her father that it was Daddy and Mummy lambs who were eating the food out of the trough. Then she went on with the game, "I want to be the baby too." Perhaps we might say that it is through the repeated experiences of Winnicott as a playful companion who was intent on understanding her that gradually over the 12 consultations enabled her to eventually allow the most profound states to be available to be seen. Certainly he addresses the questions Piggle arrives with and which he sees emerging in her play. Her more consciously articulated anxieties, what is the Babacar, who is the shush baby, the black mummy, etc., the manifest content of her material interpreted in terms of sibling rivalry, loss of the exclusive mother, etc. And inevitably the earlier breakdowns become imbued with additional layers of meaning in the après-coup of development and the analytic work. Meaning is elaborated and accrued through the analytic experience, which enriches the layers of representation in the psyche. Nevertheless, the indications of her madness keep erupting. The nightmares, her terror. For example, in consultation number 9, when she's now 3 years, 4 months, a year after they began meeting, she tells Winnicott again about her nightmares of the black mummy. Gabrielle. About the black mummy, she comes every night. I can't do anything. She's very difficult. She gets on my bed. She's not allowed to touch. No, this is my bed. I'm going to have it. I've got to sleep in it. Daddy and Mummy are in bed in another room. No, that's my bed. No, that's my bed. That's the black mummy. I have a great worry every night. It's the black mummy. I want my bed. She hasn't got one. There's no Macintosh, so I must get wet. She takes no care of her little girls. Winnicott says, "You're talking about your mummy and how she didn't know how to care for you." Gabrielle says, "Mummy does know. It's the mummy with a black face, very horrid." Winnicott says, "Do you hate her?" Gabrielle says, "I don't know what's happening to me. Goodness, I'm being forced out of bed by the black mummy, And I've got such a nice bed. No, Piggle, you haven't got a nice bed. Here she was in an experience. No, Piggle, you haven't got a nice bed. She's angry with Mummy. You've got such a horrid bed for this horrid girl. The black mummy likes me. She thinks I'm dead. Horrible. It's bull to see me. She doesn't know about children or babies. The black mummy doesn't know about babies. Winnicott says, your mummy didn't know about babies when she had you, but you taught her to be a good mother to Susan. Now, it's of interest to me that in his commentary in the margins of the published text, Winnicott refers to splitting of the good and bad mothers, thus understanding, at least in his own mind, the internal processes demonstrated by Gabrielle's material of a primitive nature. And here he links it to the arrival of the baby sister. Indeed, she refers to her sister, incorporating her as a character in the play, retrospectively also experiencing these different mothers through the prism of the presence of her sister. I've already referred to Juliet Mitchell's work about the trauma of the very notion of the sibling who has to have equal rights to mother's lap. In this clip, Gabrielle gives voice to her night terrors of a mother who thinks she's dead, even though in contradiction, the black mummy also likes her. Is this an indication of Gabrielle's sense of her mother's deep ambivalence, rooted in mother's mind, grappling with her dead objects, and also represented in Gabrielle's present but absent name of Esther, her mother's aunt who was murdered in Auschwitz? My thesis in this paper is that the profundity of Piggle's illness was glimpsed by Winnicott, but not fully appreciated, nor indeed addressed in the work. Is it too bold to say that it could only really be grasped with a more longitudinal, intergenerational view of psychic development and functioning? For all Winnicott's deep interest in the encounters between the mother's mind and that of the infant, and their ongoing consequences for the infant, he didn't yet have the conceptual tools to locate them thus. The maternal mind that is suffused with personal and intergenerational trauma is heavily challenged to be consistently present enough for the infant not to experience their psychic absence in disturbing ways. I suggest that although Piggle evidently had her parents' devotion, her mother's presence was marked by the long shadow of her family trauma in the Holocaust, and this had a consequent impact upon Piggle's capacity to robustly establish an internal sense of object constancy and to really use absence creatively. I think the concepts of absence and object constancy can help us understand the degree of disturbance in this toddler who has such a strong reaction to her sister's arrival. The breakdown that is not experienced because there is not yet an integrating function established in the infant's ego creates a flaw in the developing psyche, one which is liable to be activated under the strain of subsequent development. Her siblings' too early arrival, possibly compounded by mother's physical absence when she was lying in, thus activated the primitive breakdown. Winnicott's choice of analysis on demand unconsciously provided that element in the analytic setting which repeated the absence, and it emerged in the recurrent black mummy and black Babacar fantasies that persecuted Gabrielle, and then in the absent analyst turned black. So, in conclusion, there are many more aspects of this text which I could have addressed, but time is short. For all Winnicott's capacities for making contact with children, for receiving what they had come to say, we can see that even he struggled with his own assumptions and risked missing what was so important for Piggle to let him know about. Undoubtedly, his poor health was a factor in this work, as Claire commented in that letter. However, I think it was his profound capacity for engagement that sustained Piggle through this work and which enabled her to benefit from it. The Piggle was published posthumously 6 years after Winnicott's death and reviewed sympathetically, though not seen as without flaws. The psychoanalyst James Hood wrote, Winnicott evidently enjoyed himself immensely in an activity that centrally focuses on play and on the interpretations which make play possible again for an ill child. He adds later, perhaps even more importantly, the vague, chaotic, ill-understood, or frankly confusing episodes are also allowed their full measure of description and comment. These have to be tolerated as they are in the treatment process itself. Another review by Free Kumin observes that the account is full of moments of brilliant insight and uncanny clinical judgment, but also instances of misunderstanding, sleepiness, muddle, and missed opportunities. In other words, this is an honest and human book. And Peter Tizard, an eminent pediatric colleague of Winnicott's, wrote to Claire, "The book tells so much about Donald and brings back all sorts of memories of his talking about children and his approach to them in his ordinary outpatients. It said so much about his complete acceptance of other people, adults and children." Thank you.
I said thank you. Thank you so much, Angela, for the inspiring lecture. I feel there is so much in it and so much more we can, as you said, take from it. And I hope some of it will happen in this discussion. I just want to say that I feel that everybody here could easily fall in love with this little girl. You know, such a vivid and touching little child, really, the Piggle. And I wonder if Winnicott himself have not been falling in love with little Gabriel.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a child, if we dare to say that he did not have of his own. Is this another aspect of absence, an absence that has no words?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay, I would like to invite you all now to share with us any association, any feeling, any thought that you have. You know, it does not have to be fully articulated. And also, if you speak that it's easier for you to speak in Hebrew, so it's okay. You're most welcome. We will translate it for you. So what I suggest is that when anyone wants to speak, you have to put on the screen this hand, you know, like, how do you call it, Yon?
Feel free to click on the raise hand icon.
Raise hand, yes.
בתפריט הראשי, and then we will unmute you.
If you feel more comfortable to write in the chat is also okay, but I think it would be better if we raise hands and so we can see it immediately. David Kitron.
Yeah, David.
Yes, David.
Yes. Maybe we start just so as to facilitate the discussion a bit. And I was wondering, when I read the Piggle, and I get the feeling that in the Piggle, we see, on the one hand, we see this wonderful analyst whose capacity of empathy is so outstanding that he was well known not only for understanding children, but I think in his obituary it was written that Winnicott was this one analyst who not only understood children, but children understood him, or understood him understanding them. And we see this in the Piggle, of course. We see his charm and this empathy of his and his playfulness. But on the other hand, we also see what at least I perceive as somebody who is interpreting along quite classical lines. I think you mentioned it yourself, Freudian and Kleinian. And he's so very different when he's analyzing Margaret Little or Rosemary Dinage or other patients. I know these are examples of adult patients, but still, in these full analyses, we see the regression to dependence. And I wonder if you think this is related to the fact of this analysis as an intermittent partagé analysis and not a full analysis, or whether it is related to something else, to Winnicott as a child analyst compared to Winnicott as an adult analyst. So I wonder what are your thoughts about that?
A big question. I mean, it is very interesting how strongly interpretative style is in this, and I've often thought of it being a contributing factor to his writing. Not very many years after that actually he'd made lots of mistakes by interpreting too much. I think maybe what the comments he makes in Use of an Object may be a kind of commentary on his treatment of Piggle, where I think he does talk too much, and I think it is at too high a level of interpretation. Part of my thesis is that I think he was too close to the parents. I think their framing of their daughter's difficulties as being related to sibling rivalry, the too early arrival of the little sister. I think he didn't have sufficient objectivity, but he was, as I said, also he was an ill man. He was tired, I suspect. I think these ordinary kind of human aspects of the work have to be recognized there. I wonder also, I mean, several of his interpretations are very, very Kleinian in that sense, and certainly Klein and colleagues of mine have said, the Piggle is such a Kleinian text in a kind of curious sort of way, as though, what would Winnicott be doing writing a Kleinian text? Well, we know she was very, very influential in his own formation, and I'm sure you yourself can see much of his writing is actually in his mind in communication with Klein, and maybe this I mean, he prepared it for publication, maybe, and Klein was long since dead. Maybe there was a part of him that was saying to Klein, "Look, you're still there in my work. I haven't left you. Even though I've gone on my own path, I've still got all the things that you taught me all those years ago." I think it's over-determined. I think there are many factors really in why, but I think it's also very interesting that he really didn't, except in that little extract when he was able to somehow articulate the impact of him in Piggle's mind of his absence. Just that one session that I in consultation 12, but much of the rest of the time I felt he was very blinkered. He didn't follow his own ideas enough. I think he sort of abandoned his own ideas, which is puzzling. It's very puzzling.
Mm-hmm. I would dare to contribute another idea. Adding to your ideas. I'm not sure about it. I'm interested to know how would you feel with it. As I know, Winnicott insisted very much in writing this case, and he also wanted very much, I don't remember his name, some of his students to discuss the case, right? And I have a feeling that he really struggled with some level of very traumatic material, as you say. I agree very much with your thesis. I'm happy to that you wrote it, because it is so enlightening. But I think that maybe is being insisting on having like an audience to this case is because regression, because regression to dependency cannot happen when you're alone. I mean, you need somebody else. You need the other to hear, to make a context to those kind of psychic materials. And it is like maybe he felt that he needs someone else with him in order to be able to do it. Of course, he's not with us, as you said, but something in his was like a fire.
I think that's a very interesting idea that he really did not so much want an audience. He wanted an interlocutor. He wanted someone to, as you say, be in communication with him about it.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah.
We have another question by Ilan.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you so much. It was fascinating. I wanted to touch on the Holocaust because it put aside like this case, how it's connected to what how Smadar opened the meeting today. That we cannot, as second or third generation Holocaust survivors here in Israel, it's so connected to what is going on right now, and it just like stood up for me, like that we are really experiencing the Holocaust again, or some form of it, without even thinking about if are we the perpetrators or are we the victim? But it's so there in what is going on right now. I think that many of us experienced at that day some form of connecting to that annihilation feeling. And maybe a lot of what is going on right now in Israel is this trauma coming up to the surface. I just wanted to mention it. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And of course, I was a bit shocked at the irony of me presenting this material in this context. It wasn't meant to be like that, if you like. You know, the coincidence of it was quite shocking. And it is of course, and I refer to this in my paper. It's the Holocaust and its working through in the later years of the 20th century has been a real impetus within psychoanalysis to think about intergenerational trauma, and for us, not only to be thinking that we have a single patient, in our room, but that the patient comes with a family and a community history that is made manifest in different ways. Yes, I feel you in particular, of course, are experiencing the trauma. I think there are ripples of the trauma that are waves of the trauma, the tumult all over the world, I think, as a consequence of what's going on. Yeah.
I may say also we're experiencing splitting, strong splitting here right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel splitting within myself. Like there is a part of me that feels so like my compassion is gone on some level. It's never happened to me before that I came to a place where I would feel for at least 2 months lack of empathy completely to the other people. And I feel like I'm splitted between my compassion and my murder's impulse and my surviving impulse and my intellect. Everything is splitted. I feel right now like traumatized, splitted into many different parts. And it's very, I see it in many of my patients. Strong splitting.
We see it across the world. We see in the response across the world deep polarization and splits.
Yes.
And one can only hope and work towards, hopefully, the recovery of compassion, the recovery of empathy, the recovery of recognition of shared suffering.
Thank you.
Ilan?
Thank you, Angela, for such so rich and insightful lecture. I want to ask if the side of that he so much interpreted connects to the analysis on demands, because you're right, I think, many times that if he have time, he will not interpret it so much. In later works, he said it that that he interpreted many times when he do not have time. So part of the effort, I think, is belong to this. And I have another question. Is I don't know, is he intended to publish it? Because you know, we can see the classical interpretation also in holding an interpretation, but I'm not sure that he was at peace with fully at peace with his work. So maybe.
Well, interesting you
yeah,
mentioned that, and of course I mentioned it in my introduction there. I mean, I also think that's a piece of work that he perhaps revisited and thought, what on earth was I doing? Why did I say that? I mean, it's very interesting. I belong to a group, we call it Clinical Winnicott, and we spent a long time together reading Holding an Interpretation. I was telling Smadar earlier on, and the way we did it, because it's very difficult to read clinical material just straight off, we dramatized it. Someone took the part of Winnicott and someone took the part of the patient each time, and we would read a session per meeting. And it was so interesting because it came alive in that sort of way, but also the at the end of each kind of drama, each sort of enactment, you could say, we would look at each other and say, what is going on? And maybe that also is what happens in any analytic presentation. You know, you think, what is going on? But particularly, I think, because so much of what Winnicott does in that paper and in this is not what you expect. It's not what you expect from his writings about technique, his writings about the analytic process, about the aims of analysis. So I think these two publications are really important in the sense that they are pieces of work that he learnt from in his own contemplation about them, and it is at the end of his life that he's saying, you know, I got it wrong. I shouldn't have done all that. I stopped people understanding themselves better by being too present, too clever by half. So, you know, we have to give him the credit for learning from his experience.
Can I add something, please?
Can Memi, please.
Hi, Angela. Thanks very much for a wonderful lecture. It was lovely. I want to come back to his psychoanalytic technique that you just mentioned, because it makes me wondering, we're talking about a text that was written between 64 and 66, I think, or 66, 67. So it's really the end of his life, his late work, that all his considerations and all his technique is already quite developed. And as you read to us, even in the first session, he switches so fast from working playfully with the bear and inviting her to come and play with him and creating a wonderful interaction with her. And immediately after, series of interpretations, Freudian, Kleinian interpretations. And I was wondering, how do you understand it, that in his late work, he gives himself the freedom to be able to play and interpret even in the first session, so wildly, I would say.
I don't know, but I don't know. But my mind goes to immediately is therapeutic consultations, you know, which he had honed his technique over many years, and you know, that those initial encounters with the child, he's very bold. I mean, it's very interesting reading therapeutic consultations, because he also says many times in each of these descriptions of the encounters with these children, he comments, I didn't say anything, or I didn't make any interpretation, or, you know, he's commenting on his own technique all the time. So I think this is a struggle that he engaged with all the way through his work, actually. And I think it's probably, I mean, I don't know, it's to do with all sorts of things, but I suspect that it's at its heart, it's to do with trying to provide a facilitating environment which would support the child's expression of their own self. And you get that most obviously in therapeutic consultations. I mean, I think that the comment that was made earlier on, I think maybe he was anxious about not having time with Piggle. 1960s Oxford to London, that was a difficult journey. That these days you can do it in an hour and a half, but in those days it was much more difficult. So these reality factors, I think, were important. But so I think it's overdetermined. I think there are many different elements which meant that he worked in the way that he did. But I mean, I think it was so interesting that Piggle said to her mum that evening, "He doesn't know about the Babacar. He didn't get me. He didn't see what I brought. You know, the darkness of what I have got inside me." She knew that he didn't get her. It didn't stop her wanting to come back and work with him, because there was also something else going on.
Angela, would you say that another factor could be that he, as in the consultations indeed, that he trusted very much the parents, the healthy development, you know, the healthy environment. So maybe it is also one of the factors?
Absolutely. I mean, he says that explicitly, doesn't he? And
Yeah.
he even remarks, I think, in that introduction to the Piggle that you know, therapy can get in the way of healthy development at home. So he's sorting out these ideas all the way through to the end of his life, actually.
Yeah, that's right.
We have Uri.
Yeah. First of all, you've already answered some of my questions, but it seems that in a way he was troubled. He was like kind of anxiety himself, maybe absence anxiety, but in his eyes, not in her eyes, not in Pig's eyes. His absence in her life was troubling him, maybe because he was ill, he was kind of dealing with, you know, sickness and so on. And it seems like that he interpreted too much because of his anxiety, you know.
Yes, and he says, doesn't he, and we were talking about it earlier on before the meeting, he responds to her question about his birthday with his death day. He was preoccupied with his dying, actually. It's another 7 years. But he was very frail and very ill during that time.
Yeah. In a way, she gave him something. She gave him some kind of life.
Yes, and the point that Smada made earlier on about him not having children of his own, you know, the delight of having such a bright, playful child, engaging and charming, even though...
I mentioned it earlier,
I want to say, Angela, first of all, thank you very much for your lecture. And it was really interesting to look at Winnicott's work and really to see him not Winnicottian in any way, almost in any way. And I think for me it's very, I think he had the courage to show us some of his failures, even though he didn't think so. And I think one thing I'm thinking about Winnicott is that he makes experiments. All this setting of consultations and analysis in demand, it is something we today I think we wouldn't dare to do. It's like you can't understand the logic of it, because the time is a very profound issue in analysis, and this is part of the basic conditions we need to go to these deep processes and not only interrupt them through outside. So I think for me it's an example of, no matter how giant you are, you need the basic elements in order to do a real analytic process. And the most important one is time, because I think these interpretations and all this being there was he was stressed by not having the time, and I wonder why he accepted at first. Why? Because.
Well, I don't know. You know, there are other things that affected him and which he responded to and used very creatively. You know, he was a doctor in the health service all his life. You know, he wasn't in Hampstead in a nice private protected consulting room all that time. He was out in the real world. So that, and then the most important, I think, impact of the war, again thinking about the war and his work in the hostels in Oxfordshire, of the children who were too crazy to be fostered by families. They had to be looked after in hostels. So he was very appreciative of all the kind of which might be regarded as non-psychoanalytic factors, like food on the table, or a warm place to sit, reality elements which have huge psychic meaning. So in that sense, he was quite singular, wasn't he, in that generation of psychoanalysts. And even now, very few pediatricians actually are psychoanalysts and or sustain that dual identity. So I think those other the richness of his broad experience contributed to that. But I also think that unconsciously he chose analysis on demand for Piggle, and I don't think there's another case that he's written about. I mean, he refers to in the therapeutic consultation seeing children 2 or 3 times, but there's something about the analysis on demand for this child that I think was an unconscious communication of something about absence. Because absence is built into the lack of demand, lack of response to demand.
I would like to ask about the missing women asking you questions in this part of the meeting. I mean that most of the people were men and not women.
True.
What is the meaning if you relate it to the...
Can you offer us a meaning? It's a very interesting observation.
Maybe sort of, because he was a man, and I don't know. I don't really know. But it's very notable.
Okay, I think we will stay with a lot of mystery, more and more questions. And this is also very beautiful. We must finish. I want to thank very much Angela, and hope to see you soon with us, to see you soon again with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a very, very enjoyable and interesting occasion. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.